The morning sun barely broke through the heavy London clouds when Catherine Middleton stood before the mirror in their private quarters at Kensington Palace. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the simple black dress she had chosen for this day. William entered the room quietly, his face carrying the weight of what they were about to do. Neither of them had slept well the night before, knowing that their actions today would change everything. Outside the palace gates, hundreds of photographers had already gathered. News had leaked that the Prince and Princess of Wales would make an appearance, though no one knew exactly why. Social media buzzed with speculation. Some thought it was about a new charity initiative. Others wondered if it concerned the ongoing family tensions that had dominated headlines for months. But William and Kate knew the truth was far more profound than anyone could imagine. 3 weeks earlier, during a private visit to a children's hospice in North London, something had happened that shook them both to their core. They had met a young girl named Emma, just 7 years old, who was spending her final days in the care of devoted nurses. Emma had asked Kate a simple question that would haunt them both: why do some children have to suffer while others don't? Kate had held the little girl's hand, unable to find words that could possibly answer such a profound question from someone so young. That night, William and Kate had stayed up until dawn, talking about their roles, their privileges, and what it truly meant to serve. They discussed how their own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, lived in a bubble of protection while children like Emma faced unimaginable challenges. The conversation had led them to a decision that would shock the royal establishment and touch hearts around the world. The palace staff had noticed changes in the weeks that followed. William cancelled several formal engagements, choosing instead to spend hours on phone calls with charity directors and medical professionals. Kate had been seen crying after returning from another hospice visit, clutching a small teddy bear that Emma had given her. Their closest aides knew something significant was brewing, but even they were not prepared for what the royal couple had planned. As they prepared to leave the palace that morning, William took Kate's hand. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. They had discussed it countless times, weighing the consequences, the backlash they might face, and the precedent it would set. But every time they thought of Emma and the countless other children suffering in silence, their resolve only strengthened. The car journey to their destination was silent. Kate stared out the window at the London streets, watching ordinary people go about their daily lives. She thought about how different her life might have been if she hadn't met William at university all those years ago. But fate had brought them together, and with that union came responsibilities they were only now beginning to fully understand. Their security team was on edge. The head of protection had tried to talk them out of this plan, warning about the unpredictability of what they were about to do. But William had been firm. "Some things are more important than protocol," he had said, ending the discussion. The team had no choice but to adapt their plans to protect the royal couple during what would surely be an unprecedented event. As they arrived at their destination, not a grand palace or ceremonial venue, but a modest community centre in one of London's most deprived areas, the media presence was overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed incessantly, and speculation reached fever pitch. But William and Kate remained silent, their faces set with determination. Inside the community center, 50 families were waiting. These were families who had lost children to preventable diseases, who had watched their loved ones suffer due to lack of resources, who had been forgotten by a system that seemed to favor the privileged few. The royal couple had personally selected each family, having read their stories and been moved to tears by their struggles. The atmosphere in the room was electric with emotion. Some parents held photographs of children they had lost. Others clutched the hands of surviving siblings who bore the invisible scars of grief. As William and Kate entered, a hush fell over the room. This was not a typical royal visit with rehearsed greetings and carefully staged photo opportunities. This was raw, real, and unprecedented. Kate moved first, approaching a mother who sat alone in the corner, a picture frame pressed against her chest. Without words, Kate sat beside her, and the two women embraced. The mother's sobs echoed through the room, and Kate's own tears fell freely. There were no cameras allowed inside. William and Kate had insisted on privacy for these families, but those present would later describe it as one of the most powerful moments they had ever witnessed. William, meanwhile, knelt beside a father who had lost 3 children to a rare genetic condition that might have been treatable with earlier intervention and better resources. The man, hardened by grief and anger at a system that had failed his family, initially turned away from the prince. But William stayed there, on his knees, until the man finally looked at him. What passed between them in that moment of eye contact spoke volumes about shared humanity beyond titles and stations. For the next 2 hours, William and Kate moved through the room, sitting with families, listening to their stories, and sharing in their grief. They made no speeches, offered no platitudes about things getting better. They simply bore witness to pain that had been ignored for too long. Several times, Kate had to step outside to compose herself, overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering concentrated in that small room. One young boy, perhaps 10 years old, approached William with a question that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Why are you here?" he asked with the directness only children possess. "My mom says you're going to be king one day. Kings don't usually come to places like this." William knelt down to the boy's level and gave an answer that would later be remembered as a defining moment, because a true king serves his people, especially those who suffer the most. "I'm here to learn how to be better." As word spread about what was happening inside the community center, crowds began to gather outside. These weren't the usual royal watchers hoping for a glimpse of glamour. These were people from the community, many of whom had their own stories of loss and struggle. They stood in respectful silence, understanding that something profound was taking place. Inside, Kate was sitting with a group of mothers who had formed a support group after losing children. They shared stories about the lack of mental health support, the dismissive attitudes of some medical professionals, and the way grief had been compounded by financial struggles. Kate took notes, asking detailed questions about what specific changes could make a difference. This wasn't a ceremonial visit, it was a working session that would form the basis of what was to come. The most difficult moment came when they met Sarah, a single mother who had lost her daughter Lucy to a condition that could have been managed with proper medication. The medication existed but was deemed too expensive for widespread use. Sarah had fought for months to get it for Lucy, writing letters, starting petitions, even camping outside government buildings. But bureaucracy had moved too slowly, and Lucy had died just 2 weeks before her 8th birthday. Kate held Sarah as she recounted her daughter's final days, how Lucy had still been making jokes and trying to cheer up the nurses even as her body failed. William stood nearby, his fists clenched as he listened to how the system had failed this bright, brave little girl. When Sarah finished her story, she looked directly at the royal couple and asked, "What are you going to do about it?" Not just sympathy, what are you actually going to do? It was the question they had been preparing to answer, the reason they had gathered these families together. But, first, they needed to complete their journey through the room, ensuring every family felt heard and valued. Each story added weight to their resolve, each tear shed strengthened their determination to act. As the morning wore on, something remarkable happened. The families began to connect with each other, sharing contact information, offering support, and creating an informal network born from shared experience. William and Kate watched this organic formation of community with hope. They knew that real change came not just from top-down initiatives but from grassroots movements of people supporting each other. By the time they had spoken with every family, William and Kate were emotionally exhausted. But they knew the hardest part was still to come. They had made promises in that room, not vague royal commitments to raise awareness, but specific pledges to use their position to force change. Now they had to deliver on those promises, knowing it would put them at odds with tradition, possibly even with other members of the royal family. As they prepared to leave the community center, the families gathered around them. There were no formal farewells, no rehearsed thank yous. Instead, there was a moment of shared understanding that this was just the beginning. Emma's mother, who had traveled from the hospice to be there, pressed something into Kate's hand. It was a small charm bracelet that Emma had made in her final days, with a note that said, "For the princess who cried with me." Kate clutched the bracelet as they walked toward the exit. Outside, the crowds had grown larger, and the media presence was now international. Reporters from around the world had descended on the scene, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. William and Kate paused at the doorway, knowing that once they stepped outside and faced the cameras, there would be no turning back. They had prepared a statement, but, as they looked at each other, they realized words on paper could never convey what they had just experienced. The protocol demanded they stick to the script, that they maintain the careful royal balance of compassion and distance. But protocol had no place in what they were about to do. William squeezed Kate's hand one more time, and she nodded. Together, they stepped out into the grey London morning, ready to make the statement that would send shockwaves around the world. The crowds fell silent, cameras focused, and the world held its breath as the Prince and Princess of Wales prepared to break centuries of royal tradition in the name of those who had suffered in silence for too long. The silence outside the community centre was deafening. Thousands had gathered, forming a sea of faces that stretched down the narrow London street. Camera crews from every major news network in the world had their lenses trained on the royal couple. The absence of the usual fanfare, no podium, no prepared stage, no ceremonial arrangements, made the moment even more powerful. Kate's eyes were still red from crying, and she made no attempt to hide it. William's jaw was set with determination as he looked out at the crowd. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, in a break from all protocol, they walked down the steps and moved directly into the crowd, their security detail scrambling to keep up. An elderly woman in the front row reached out, and Kate took her weathered hand. "My granddaughter," the woman whispered, "she died waiting for treatment. 3 years old." Kate didn't let go of her hand as William began to speak, his voice carrying without any microphone, raw and unfiltered. "We have just spent the morning with 50 families who have lost children to preventable causes," William began, his voice cracking slightly. "Children who died not because medicine couldn't save them, but because the system failed them. Children who suffered not because their conditions were untreatable, but because their treatments were deemed too expensive." A ripple went through the crowd. Royal statements were typically carefully worded, diplomatic, and non-confrontational. This was different. This was direct, accusatory even, and completely unprecedented. Palace communication officials watching from their offices were already in crisis mode, but William and Kate had turned off their phones, cutting themselves off from any attempts to manage or soften their message. Kate spoke next, still holding the elderly woman's hand. "I met a little girl named Emma 3 weeks ago. She asked me why some children suffer while others don't. I couldn't answer her. Emma died yesterday morning, surrounded by love but failed by a healthcare system that prioritizes profit over young lives." The crowd was completely silent now, many people crying openly. Reporters who had covered royal events for decades had never witnessed anything like this. The careful distance typically maintained between royalty and raw emotion had completely dissolved. "We stand here today not as prince and princess, but as parents," William continued, his arm around Kate as she struggled to maintain composure. "As parents who have held our own children and cannot imagine the pain these families have endured. As human beings who have witnessed suffering that should not exist in a civilized society." Behind them, through the windows of the community center, some of the families they had met were watching. Sarah, the mother who had lost her daughter Lucy, pressed her hand against the glass, tears streaming down her face as she heard the future king speaking her daughter's name to the world. "Lucy Thompson died because a medication that could have saved her life was restricted due to cost," William said, his voice growing stronger. "Oliver Martinez suffered for months because his family's postal code meant he couldn't access the same treatments available just miles away. These are not statistics. These are children whose lives mattered, whose deaths were preventable, and whose families deserve more than our sympathy, they deserve action." Kate pulled out a piece of paper from her pocket, not an official statement, but notes she had handwritten during their meeting with the families. Her hands shook as she began to read the names. Emma Williams, age 7. Lucy Thompson, age 8. Oliver Martinez, age 5. Amara Patel, age 4. She continued, reading every single name of the 50 children whose families they had met, her voice breaking multiple times but never stopping. As the names echoed through the street, people in the crowd began to kneel. It started with one person, then spread like a wave through the thousands gathered. Even some of the reporters lowered their cameras, overwhelmed by the moment. By the time Kate finished reading the last name, baby Joseph Chen, aged 3 months, nearly everyone was on their knees in a spontaneous moment of collective grief. William helped Kate fold the paper, and, then, did something that would become one of the most photographed moments in royal history. He and Kate knelt down too, there on the cold pavement, among the people. For a full minute, silence reigned as thousands knelt together in memory of children whose deaths had been preventable. When they rose, William's voice was firm with resolve. Today, we make a commitment that will likely upset many within the establishment. We are establishing the Emma Williams Foundation, named after the brave little girl who asked the question we could not answer. This foundation will not be another royal charity that holds galas and raises awareness. It will be a direct action organization that challenges policies, funds treatments, and holds systems accountable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Royal charities were typically neutral, avoiding anything that could be seen as political. What William was proposing crossed every traditional boundary. Kate took over, her voice stronger now, fueled by purpose. We will be liquidating personal assets to fund this foundation, she announced. We are starting with £10 million of our personal funds, not taxpayer money. We call on others in positions of privilege to do the same. The time for charity balls and awareness campaigns has passed. We need real resources for real change. The palace communications team, watching from their offices, were in full panic mode. This wasn't just breaking protocol, it was shattering it. The royal family didn't make political statements, didn't challenge government policies, didn't put their personal wealth on the line for causes. But William and Kate were past caring about tradition. Furthermore, William continued, we will be using our position to demand legislative change. We will be meeting with the Prime Minister, health officials, and anyone else who has the power to prevent these tragedies. And, if they refuse to act, we will not stop speaking out. Some will say this is not the role of the monarchy. We say that if the monarchy's role doesn't include protecting the most vulnerable, then, that role needs to change. A young mother in the crowd pushed forward, carrying a baby. What about us? She called out. Those of us still fighting for our children? Kate moved toward her immediately, security trying to intervene but William waving them off. What's your name? Kate asked, reaching for the baby's tiny hand. Rebecca. This is Thomas. He needs surgery, but we've been waiting 8 months. They say it's not urgent enough. Kate looked directly into a nearby news camera. Rebecca and Thomas from North London. Surgery needed, 8 months waiting. She turned back to Rebecca. We will remember. We will follow up. This is not just about those we've lost, but those we can still save. What followed was extraordinary. People in the crowd began calling out their own stories, their own children's names, their own battles with a system that had failed them. William and Kate stood there, listening to each one, Kate taking notes, William asking questions. Their scheduled departure time came and went, but they didn't move. The international response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support, #WilliamandKateForChange trending globally within minutes. World leaders were being asked for comments, medical professionals were weighing in, and ordinary people were sharing their own stories of loss and medical neglect. But it was the response from within the palace that would prove most challenging. As William and Kate finally prepared to leave, 3 hours after their scheduled departure, William's phone rang with a call from the Queen's private secretary. He looked at the screen, then at Kate, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. He declined the call. We need to go to the hospice, Kate said quietly. Emma's parents want us there for the memorial service this afternoon. William nodded. They had already broken so many rules, attending a private memorial service without official approval seemed minor in comparison. But they both knew it was another line crossed, another tradition broken in service of something greater. As their car finally pulled away from the community center, the crowd remained, many still kneeling, others embracing, all processing what they had just witnessed. News anchors struggled to find words to describe the unprecedented scene. Royal correspondents who had built careers on understanding protocol were left speechless. Inside the car, Kate held the charm bracelet Emma had made, while William stared out the window at the London streets passing by. They knew there would be consequences. The palace would demand explanations, the government would be uncomfortable, and critics would accuse them of overstepping their bounds. But, in that moment, none of that mattered. "Do you think she would have approved?" Kate asked quietly, thinking of Emma. "I think she would have asked why we didn't do it sooner," William replied. Their driver, who had served the royal family for 20 years, broke protocol himself to speak. "My nephew died of leukemia last year, Your Highnesses. Couldn't afford the experimental treatment. What you did today, thank you." As news of their statement spread across time zones, responses poured in from around the world. Celebrities began pledging money to the Emma Williams Foundation before it was even formally established. Medical professionals offered their services pro bono. Most surprisingly, members of other royal families in Europe began reaching out, privately expressing support and asking how they could implement similar initiatives. The car arrived at the hospice where Emma had spent her final days. It was a modest building, understaffed and underfunded, a far cry from the gleaming private hospitals that served the wealthy. William and Kate entered through a side door, avoiding the media that had already gathered at the front. Inside, they found Emma's parents, Mark and Julie Williams, preparing for their daughter's memorial service. The small chapel was filled with handmade decorations, paper butterflies that Emma had loved, drawings by other children in the hospice, and photographs of a little girl whose smile remained bright even as her body failed her. "She watched you on television once," Julie said softly, managing a sad smile. "Said you seemed nice but sad. She wanted to send you a letter to cheer you up. Never got to finish it." Kate broke down completely then, sobbing in a way that would have horrified royal handlers. But Emma's parents didn't offer platitudes or try to comfort her. They simply sat with her and shared grief, understanding that sometimes tears are the only appropriate response to unbearable loss. The memorial service was unlike any royal event in history. William and Kate sat in folding chairs among hospice workers, volunteers, and other families who had lost children. They sang hymns from photocopied sheets, listened to Emma's favorite story read by a nurse who had cared for her, and watched a slideshow of photographs set to a song Emma had loved. When it came time for remembrances, William stood without any prepared remarks. He spoke about meeting Emma, about her question that had changed everything, about how a 7-year-old's wisdom had exposed the failures of systems run by adults. He promised, there in that small chapel, that Emma's question would not go unanswered, that her life, though brief, would spark changes that saved others. As the service ended, something unexpected happened. The other families present began sharing their own stories, and what had been Emma's memorial became a communal expression of grief, anger, and determination. Parents who had suffered in isolation found community. Siblings who had lost brothers and sisters found others who understood their pain. Kate quietly began organizing, taking contact information, creating WhatsApp groups, and laying the groundwork for support networks. This wasn't royal charity from above, it was grassroots organizing powered by shared experience and royal backing. William spoke with hospice administrators, learning about funding shortfalls, staffing crises, and the daily struggles of providing dignified care with inadequate resources. By the time they left the hospice, darkness had fallen over London. The palace had sent 17 increasingly urgent messages, but William and Kate had maintained their silence. They knew that when they returned to Kensington Palace, there would be a reckoning. Traditional courtiers would be appalled, constitutional experts would raise concerns, and the mechanism of royal protocol would try to reassert itself. But, as they drove through the London streets, they saw something that strengthened their resolve. In windows across the city, candles had been lit, a spontaneous memorial for all the children whose names Kate had read that morning. Social media showed similar scenes from Manchester, Birmingham, Edinburgh, Belfast. The statement they had made had touched something deep in the national consciousness. "There's no going back now," William said quietly. "Would you want to?" Kate asked. He thought of his grandmother, of centuries of tradition, of the careful balance the monarchy had maintained. Then, he thought of Emma's question, of Lucy's mother's tears, of all the preventable suffering they had witnessed. "Never," he said firmly. Their phone finally rang with a call that couldn't be ignored, the king himself. William answered, and Kate could hear the controlled anger in her father-in-law's voice. The conversation was brief, ending with a summons to Buckingham Palace first thing in the morning. As they arrived home at Kensington Palace, their children were already asleep. William and Kate looked in on each of them, George, Charlotte, and Louis, safe, healthy, and protected. The contrast with what they had witnessed that day was stark and undeniable. They sat up late into the night, planning. The Emma Williams Foundation would need structure, leadership, and strategy. They made lists of allies and obstacles, drafted frameworks for direct action, and prepared for the battle they knew was coming. The establishment would push back hard, but they had something more powerful than tradition on their side, the moral authority of parents who had lost children to preventable causes. As dawn approached, they finally tried to sleep, knowing that the next day would bring confrontation with the very institution they represented. But they had crossed their Rubicon. The silent statement had been made, and now the real work would begin. The summons to Buckingham Palace came at dawn. William and Kate dressed carefully, knowing that their appearance would be scrutinized not just by the king but by history itself. They chose simple, dark clothing, a deliberate contrast to the ornate ceremonial dress typically expected for palace meetings. As their car passed through the palace gates, protesters had already gathered, but these weren't the usual anti-monarchy demonstrators. These were parents holding photographs of children, standing in silent support. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was arctic. Senior courtiers lined the hallways, their faces masks of disapproval. The Lord Chamberlain, a man who had served the royal family for 40 years, could barely meet their eyes. They were led to the king's private study, where they found not just Charles but a gathering of senior royals and advisors, an informal trial of sorts. The king stood by the window, his back to them as they entered. The silence stretched uncomfortably before he finally turned, his face a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps understanding, though buried deep beneath decades of training in royal restraint. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Charles began, his voice controlled but with an edge that revealed the depth of his displeasure. "Centuries of political neutrality, destroyed in a single morning. The Prime Minister has called an emergency cabinet meeting. The constitutional lawyers are in uproar. The very foundation of our existence as a constitutional monarchy has been shaken." William stepped forward, his posture straight and unyielding. "We did what was right, not what was traditional." "Right?" The king's voice rose slightly. "You think destroying the delicate balance that has kept this institution alive is right? You think turning the monarchy into a political pressure group is right?" Kate spoke for the first time, her voice calm but firm. "We think preventing children from dying unnecessarily is right. We think using our privilege to protect those without privilege is right. If that threatens the institution, then perhaps the institution needs to change." The room erupted. Advisors began speaking over each other, constitutional precedents were quoted, warnings about Republican movements were raised. But William raised his hand, and, surprisingly, the room fell silent. "I want everyone except family to leave," he said. It wasn't a request. After a moment's hesitation and a nod from the king, the advisors filed out, leaving just Charles, Camilla, William, and Kate. Once alone, the dynamics shifted. Charles sank into a chair, suddenly, looking older than his years. "Do you think I don't care about suffering children?" he asked quietly. "Do you think in all my years of charity work, I haven't seen the same things you've seen? Then, why didn't you do something about it?" William challenged, years of frustration finally boiling over. "You had the platform, the influence. Why was it always about raising awareness instead of demanding change?" Charles's face flushed. "Because that's not how we survive, William. The moment we become political, we become disposable. The monarchy exists because we remain above the fray, because we represent continuity, not controversy." "Children are dying," Kate said simply. "Emma Williams died asking why some children suffer while others don't. How can we remain above that particular fray?" Camilla, who had been silent, finally spoke. "I lost a cousin when I was young," she said softly. "Treatable condition, but the treatment wasn't available where we lived." "I understand the pain. But understanding and acting are different things when you wear the crown.
Then, maybe it's time to redefine what wearing the crown means, William replied.
The argument continued for 2 hours. Charles presented every constitutional argument, every historical precedent, every warning about the monarchy's survival. William and Kate countered with moral arguments, with the names of dead children, with the question of what the monarchy was surviving for if not to serve the people.
Finally, Charles asked the question that hung in the air: are you prepared to give it up? The succession, the titles, everything? Because that's what you're risking. William didn't hesitate. If the choice is between a crown and saving children's lives, it's no choice at all.
The king studied his son for a long moment. Then, something shifted in his expression. Your mother would have said the same thing, he admitted quietly. She probably would have done what you did yesterday, just sooner and with more cameras.
The mention of Diana changed the atmosphere in the room.
Charles stood, walked to a portrait of the late Princess of Wales that hung in his private study, one of the few in the palace.
She understood something I learned too late, that the heart of monarchy isn't the crown, it's the connection to people's pain.
Kate moved closer to Charles.
We're not trying to destroy the institution. We're trying to save it by making it relevant to people's real lives. The Emma Williams Foundation won't just be about charity, it will be about accountability, about using royal influence to demand systemic change.
Charles was quiet for a moment. Then, the government will fight you.
The establishment will try to silence you. Traditional supporters will abandon us.
And thousands of families who have lost children will stand with us, William countered.
Which matters more?
The king walked to his desk and pulled out a file. Inside were newspaper clippings, letters, photographs, a secret archive of children's causes he had wanted to champion more aggressively but had been advised against.
There was a boy named Marcus, he said softly. 20 years ago. Died because his rare condition wasn't considered worth the research investment.
I wanted to establish a fund to demand action.
I was told it would be inappropriate, too political. I've regretted my silence ever since.
He looked at William and Kate with new understanding.
You've already crossed the line. There's no undoing what you've done.
So if you're going to destroy centuries of precedent, at least do it properly.
What followed was unexpected.
Charles didn't withdraw his disapproval of their methods, but he began offering tactical advice. Which politicians could be pressured, which business leaders might contribute, how to use royal patronages as leverage for change. Camilla added her own insights from years of charity work, identifying key figures in the medical establishment who had been frustrated by systemic failures.
You'll need protection, Charles said finally.
Not just physical security, but legal and political cover.
I can't publicly support what you're doing, not yet.
But I won't stop you, and I'll ensure others don't either. As the meeting concluded, William embraced his father, not the formal gesture typically seen in public, but a real embrace between father and son.
I know what this costs you, William said quietly.
Not as much as silence has cost those families, Charles replied. William and Kate left Buckingham Palace through the same halls they had entered, but the atmosphere was different. Some courtiers still disapproved, but others nodded slightly as they passed, subtle signs of support from within the establishment itself. Outside, the crowd of supporters had grown. As their car emerged from the palace gates, someone started applauding. Soon, thousands were clapping, not the polite applause of royal watchers but the passionate response of people who felt seen and heard for the first time.
Back at Kensington Palace, an extraordinary scene was unfolding.
Their staff had transformed the public rooms into a makeshift foundation headquarters. Volunteers from the morning's crowd had arrived, offering expertise in everything from medical research to social media campaigns. Donated computers were being set up, phone lines installed, and the infrastructure of a movement was taking shape. Among the volunteers was Dr. James Patterson, one of Britain's leading pediatric oncologists, who had taken a day off work to help. I've been fighting these battles from inside the system for 20 years, he told William.
Having royal backing changes everything.
We can finally name names, cite specific policies, and demand accountability. Kate was in another room with a group of bereaved mothers, planning the foundation's first campaign. They decided to start with medication access, specifically targeting the bureaucratic processes that delayed or denied treatments based on cost rather than medical need. Each mother brought expertise born from fighting for their own children, knowledge of which forms to file, which officials to pressure, which journalists would listen. The palace's communications team, having accepted the new reality, began working on strategies to protect William and Kate from the inevitable backlash. They prepared for attacks from traditionalist media, from politicians who benefited from the status quo, from those who would accuse the royals of overstepping their bounds. But the public response overwhelmed all opposition. Within 24 hours of the announcement, the Emma Williams Foundation had received pledges totaling £15 million. Tech billionaires, celebrities, and ordinary citizens contributed what they could. More importantly, thousands volunteered their skills: lawyers offering pro bono work, doctors volunteering for medical panels, researchers sharing suppressed studies about treatment inequalities. The first major test came 3 days later. The health secretary, under pressure from pharmaceutical companies, gave a press conference dismissing the royal intervention as well-meaning but uninformed. He suggested that William and Kate didn't understand the complexities of healthcare economics. Within an hour, Kate responded with her own press conference at the community center where it had all begun. But she didn't come alone. She stood with Dr. Patterson and 5 other leading medical professionals who systematically demolished the health secretary's arguments with facts, figures, and heartbreaking case studies. The visual of the future queen consort backed by medical expertise against a politician defending the status quo was powerful and impossible to ignore. William, meanwhile, used his military connections to organize logistics. Former servicemen and women, inspired by their former commander's stand, volunteered to help coordinate foundation activities across the country. They established local chapters in every major city, creating a network that could respond quickly to families in crisis. The breakthrough came 2 weeks after the initial statement. A whistleblower from within the National Health Service, inspired by the royal stand, leaked documents showing that certain life-saving medications were being rationed not based on medical necessity but on postal codes, effectively condemning children in poorer areas to suffer or die. The scandal was enormous, and the Emma Williams Foundation was perfectly positioned to channel public anger into action. William and Kate called for a national day of remembrance for children lost to preventable causes. They asked people to stand outside their homes at 7 p.m., the time Emma Williams had died, and light candles. The response exceeded all expectations. Satellite images that night showed Britain glowing with millions of points of light, each representing a life lost or a family standing in solidarity. International pressure began to build. Other European royals, inspired by William and Kate's courage, began their own initiatives. The Swedish crown princess established a similar foundation. The Spanish royals announced investigations into child healthcare access. What had started in a London community centre was becoming a global movement. The political establishment's resistance began to crumble. The Prime Minister, facing plummeting approval ratings and recognizing the shifting tide, announced a comprehensive review of child healthcare access. But William and Kate, advised by the families they had met, refused to accept vague promises. They demanded specific commitments, timelines, and accountability measures. The Foundation's first victory came exactly 1 month after Emma Williams' death. The government announced emergency funding to provide previously restricted medications to all children who needed them, regardless of location or economic status. It was called the Emma Williams Act, and it passed Parliament with overwhelming support after public pressure made opposition politically toxic. Kate stood in the same community center where they had made their initial statement, this time surrounded by families who would benefit from the new law. "This is just the beginning," she said, holding the charm bracelet Emma had made. "We promised to answer Emma's question about why some children suffer while others don't. Today, we've started to change that answer." The ripple effects continued. Medical schools began mandatory courses on healthcare inequality. Pharmaceutical companies, facing boycotts organized by the Foundation, started voluntary programs to provide medications at cost for children. The Foundation's legal team successfully challenged discriminatory policies in court, setting precedents that would protect vulnerable children for generations. But perhaps the most profound change was in the monarchy itself. The institution that had survived by remaining above controversy had found new purpose in championing the vulnerable. Public support for the royal family reached unprecedented levels, not because of pageantry or tradition, but because they had shown themselves willing to risk everything for those who had nothing. 6 months after Emma Williams' death, William and Kate returned to her grave. It was a private visit, just them and Emma's parents. The cemetery was quiet, but around Emma's headstone were hundreds of small tokens, toys, letters, flowers left by families whose children had been saved by the changes her death had inspired. "She changed the world," Julie Williams said softly, tracing her daughter's name on the stone. "No," Kate replied gently, "she asked the question that changed the world. We just made sure people heard it." As they stood in that cemetery, William's phone buzzed with a message from the king. Parliament had just passed the second phase of healthcare reforms, guaranteeing funding for pediatric research into rare diseases. The message ended with words that would have been unthinkable months before: "Your mother would be proud. I am too." The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the cemetery and the city beyond. In hospital wards across the country, children were receiving treatments that had been denied just months before. Support groups born from that first meeting were flourishing, providing community for grieving families and advocacy for those still fighting. The Emma Williams Foundation had become more than a charity, it was a movement that had fundamentally altered the relationship between privilege and responsibility. William took Kate's hand as they prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles with entrenched interests, new children whose lives hung in the balance. But they had answered Emma's question in the only way that mattered, not with words, but with action that saved lives. As they walked through the cemetery gates, they passed a young mother with a small boy, visiting another grave. The woman recognized them and stopped. "My daughter died 2 years ago," she said simply. "What you've done won't bring her back, but it means other mothers won't go through what I did. Thank you." Kate embraced her, and, in that moment, the true power of their silent statement was clear. They had shattered royal protocol not for headlines or popularity, but to ensure that no more children would die asking why they had to suffer. The world had indeed broken down in tears that day at the community center, but from those tears had grown a movement that would save countless lives. The monarchy had evolved, choosing relevance over tradition, compassion over protocol. And, in making that choice, William and Kate had not weakened the institution, they had given it a purpose worthy of the modern age. The crown jewels might symbolize royal power, but the charm bracelet made by a dying 7-year-old had become the symbol of royal purpose. As their car drove away, the sun was setting over London, painting the sky in shades of hope. Somewhere in the city, a child who would have died was taking medicine that would save their life. Somewhere else, parents were finding support in their grief. And, everywhere, the question Emma Williams had asked continued to echo, demanding answers not in words but in lives saved and suffering prevented. The world had broken down in tears, but from those tears had come transformation. The silent statement had been made, and its echoes would resonate through generations, a testament to the power of compassion over convention, of moral courage over institutional comfort, and of two people who chose to use their privilege to challenge the very systems that had granted it.